Hello. At one time, I started writing down my stories about my life. I thought I'd get it published. Then I changed my mind, but I still got these little stories that I told that happened to me when I grew up. I want to write this one. Here's a pleasant one. I don't have that many pleasant ones, but I do have this one. Now, first of all, I'm going to show you a little picture of what I looked like at the time I told you this story here. I was about 6 or 7 years old, probably close to 7. But anyway, this is a story when I visited my grandmother. I got it wrote down, so I'm going to read it. Okay, Grandma lived in Charleston, West Virginia. She was my maternal grandmother. I can only remember visiting her a few times in my years growing up. I was about 7 years old the first time I remember going to see her, and it etched in my memory because it was at Christmas time, and I wasn't about to forget such a nice Christmas. My mother, my sister Jane, and I boarded a greyhound bus, and off to Grandma's home we went. I was so excited because it was the first time I ever been back very far from home. It was also the first time to see a big city and the first time to ever ride on a greyhound bus. I waved at the driver from a yard, but never dreamed I'd actually get to ride on one. I'll never forget that moment I stepped up on top onto that big bus. The handrails were bright and shiny. I could smell leather like when you buy a new car. I never smelled new leather before, and it was a brand new experience for me. The seats were dark blue velvet with white towels draped over the backs. People smiled at me as we made our way to a vacant seat. We all sat together. Since I was in front of Jane, I got to sit by the window. I felt like I was sitting on a cloud, and when the bus began to move, I felt like I had the world right in my hands. I stared out the window constantly so I wouldn't miss anything. When we arrived in Charleston, a whole new world began to unfold before my eyes. I saw men in white aprons working on the street in open-air produce markets. Heaps of oranges and grapefruits and lemons and apples and other fruit were displayed the whole length of the sidewalk in front of the store. I had never seen such fruit in my life. I didn't even know it existed. As we traveled deeper into the city, we were suddenly engulfed in tall buildings. Hundreds of people were scampering in every direction, crossing the streets, going in and out of stores, carrying packages, smoking cigars, and ladies walking on 5-inch heels I never saw in my life. I didn't even know a place like this existed. I'd seen pictures in magazines and newspapers, but that didn't compare with the real thing. It was beginning to get dark, and the street lights were coming on, and the neon lights of every shape and size was shimmering and flashing and drawing attention to the businesses. When we arrived at the Greyhound station on Summer Street, we then had to cross the street to catch a city bus to where we needed to go. My mother had a deft grip on my hand as we crossed in the heavy traveled street. I think she about dragged Jane and I across the street because I had trouble with my legs catching up, and I felt my feet actually touching the street a couple times. After a few minutes on the bus, my mother realized she'd bypassed the place we were to get off. So she went up and told the driver. In a few minutes, we met another bus, and the driver helped us over to the other bus, and everything was fine again. We disembarked in North Charleston near a store named Van Never Closed. We had to walk a good piece, probably a couple blocks, to get to Grandma's house. Her house sat a few 100 feet from a railroad track, maybe a couple 100 feet. Lights were on in the house, so we knew she was home. My mother knocked on the door, and Grandma opened it and stared at us. Her eyesight was bad, and she wasn't expecting us and had no idea who we were. The family didn't see each other often. She had been to visit us before, so I knew what she looked like. Would you have something to eat for a woman and a couple of kids?" Mom asked. Grandma squinted at us through her glasses and said, "Bring 'em on in, I'll rake up something for you." She didn't recognize Mom until we stepped inside. Then she cried and was so happy to see us. She had snow-white hair piled up on the back of her head and a white apron on over her dress. Grandpa was sitting back in the rocking chair smoking a pipe. He was a thin man and legally blind. He wore a mustache. He was a jolly person and laughed a lot. This was the first time I had ever seen him. Shortly after we arrived, he had to go to work. Grandma packed a dinner bucket for him, and he walked about 200 feet carrying his lantern to an enclosed lot. He had been hired to guard something in the building. His job was night watchman. As a little girl, I wondered why he carried the lantern, because if he couldn't see, why did he need it, I thought. When I asked Grandma why he carried the lantern, what good does it do, she said, if anybody out to do no good, he sees it, they won't know he's blind. It didn't make any sense to me, but after I grew up and looked back on the instance, I realized Grandpa knew what he was doing by carrying the lantern. It not only would deter someone who might want to rob the place, but also provide warmth on a chilly December night. There wasn't many things to do for fun at Grandma's, but it was just being there that was enjoyable. I watched her make chicken dressing. I never tasted dressing like that before nor since. It was rich in herbs and onions, great food. I could make chicken dressing, but it never tasted like hers. The radio was the main source of entertainment, and at night, Grandma kept the sound low until someone came on that she liked. Then she would go up and turn the radio volume up. An old-time preacher came on the air. He said if anyone wanted to be healed, to place their hand on the radio while he prayed for them. Grandma got up out of her rocking chair and walked over to the radio and placed her hand on the radio and held it there while the preacher prayed. Grandpa just sat there in his rocking chair, tilting back and forth, smoking his pipe. When the prayer was over, he burst out laughing. Grandma tried to get him to be quiet, but he just laughed more. Finally, she cursed at him. Then he called her a hypocritical woman. One word led to another, and Grandma flew out the room in a rage and returned promptly with a rolling pin in her hand. By that time, Grandpa had already fled to his room and locked the door. Grandma stood by the door and kept yelling at him, but he wouldn't come out. My mother was smiling about the whole thing, and of course, when she thought it was funny, Jane and I did too, so we all had a good laugh. Of course, I wasn't shocked at all the witnessing the ruckus because I thought I'd been through it a lot in my life. Jane and I slept in the same bed across the room where my mother and Grandma were sleeping. The bed had a thick feather tick on it. It was so soft I could almost bury myself in it. The room was toasty and warm. I was so comfortable, unlike our cold rooms at home without any fire. I tried to snuggle in for the night, but the excitement of the trip and the strong noise kept me awake. The ticking of the clock in the hallway, cars honking, grinding sounds from a carbide plant across the river, and the freight trains going down the track was all new to me. The clickety-clack, rumbling down the tracks and loud, shrill whistle lured me to the window to see what was going on. I could see lights in the distance. Scattered in the distance. The moon was shining, and I could see the dark image of a train moving fast down the track. I heard the wheels screech and the bells ringing. I gazed out the window in total wonderment as the train disappeared from my view. It was a spectacular moment for a little farm girl. Grandma also had a bed in the living room. Jane and I sat on the bed and played. There was a box on the back side of the bed filled with white bags of candy. Grandpa would slip us a piece of candy. When Mom and Grandma wasn't looking, we would chew the candy until she looked our way, and then we'd stop. We knew we wasn't supposed to eat the candy until the next day, which was Christmas. Both Grandma and Mom knew we were eating it, but also knew who was giving it to us, so they let us think we were getting away with it. It was the first time I'd ever seen candy in white bags. I had never tasted candy like that before. One day a boy, about 9 or 10 years old, wearing a Boy Scout uniform, came to the house and stood by the door and stared at Jane and I. He wouldn't sit down when Grandma asked him to. He just stood by the door and stared at us. He answered Grandma's question, but that was about it. When he left, Grandma said it was a little boy next door. He was jealous because other kids were there. I never forgot that little boy. The short visit soon passed, and we had to go home. We stayed about 3 days. The trip back wasn't nearly as much fun. The bus was different, the seats didn't smell the same, and the driver was grouchy. When we went back to school, Jane told everybody that her grandma wore a size 18 shoe. Of course, nobody believed her, but she told it anyway. Then, to cover up for one lie, she told one on me. She said I saw a little boy and cried to bring him home with me. Some of the kids teased me about it, but most of the kids knew she was lying. She was always making up stories. I don't recall ever going back to Grandma's again growing up. My mother went to see her mother. That was her mother. Probably once a year. I was always glad when she left because Dad did the cooking, and it was different than hers. He made hot cakes every morning. I really liked his cooking. He didn't cook that many different things, but he kept us fed. He made a pot of beans and cornbread. That was supper. Sometimes he made a pot of corn mush for supper, then fry the leftovers for breakfast. I liked that too. He'd have kraut and stewed potatoes, or roasted sweet potatoes and roasted pumpkin, or baked apples and popcorn or cracker walnuts. It was great because it was different when he was cooking. Yes, the visit that Christmas to Grandma's was one of the happiest times in my young life. I can still taste the chocolate and mint candies that were stashed in the box on the bed and the zesty, spicy flavor of her homemade dressing. Well, that was a little experience I had when I was a little girl. I didn't have that many of them. I'm going to read some of the ones I didn't have, but I was going to publish this as a book, but I decided not to do that. But anyway, I've got another videos coming up pretty quick. Next couple of days I have another trip I made. And I want to thank all of you for listening. I'm getting some views, and I'm getting more subscribers. I'm just tickled to death about that. Thank you for listening. And I just thank you for listening. I lose a train of thought sometimes, don't know what I want to say. Well, anyway, I'll see you soon with another story or something.